She was left homeless and penniless after her divorce, with only a baby in her arms. With her last dollar, she bought a rusty old bus that everyone considered scrap metal. But what she did with it next turned into a real miracle and changed her life forever. Write in the comments where you are watching this video from, and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Maria sat on the edge of the narrow motel bed, her arms wrapped around the tiny bundle of warmth pressed against her chest. The neon sign outside blinked through the thin curtains, a dull pulse of red and blue that reminded her of a heartbeat struggling to keep time. The room smelled faintly of mildew and old carpet cleaner, and the air conditioner rattled as if it too was on its last breath. She closed her eyes and tried to will herself into believing this was temporary, just a passing storm, but reality pressed on her with the weight of iron. There was nothing left of the life she had once imagined, nothing left of the promises whispered to her years ago by the man who had walked away and left her with nothing but debts and a baby who depended on her for everything. She remembered how quickly it had all fallen apart. The marriage had begun with hope, as they all do, with laughter and shared dreams and a belief that together they could weather any storm. But storms can erode even the strongest foundations. And by the time she discovered the betrayal, by the time she realized the house they had built together was already crumbling under the weight of unpaid bills and broken trust, it was too late. The lawyers had taken their share, the creditors had taken the rest, and the man who had once sworn to protect her had taken whatever was left of her pride. What remained was what she clutched in her arms now, her only true possession, her infant son whose eyes seemed far too trusting for a world that had already shown her its cruelty. The few bills in her purse were counted over and over, her fingers smoothing the creases as though gentleness could somehow multiply them. She knew exactly how long they would last. 3 nights in this motel, maybe 4 if she skipped meals, and then nothing. The thought of shelters flickered in her mind, but every story she had heard about them filled her with dread. She could not bear the idea of bringing her baby into a place that smelled of despair, where strangers cried themselves to sleep in bunks stacked one on top of the other. She needed something else, something more permanent, even if it was only a shell of a dream. That night, as her son's small breaths warmed the hollow of her collarbone, Maria let her mind wander. She pictured a place where she did not have to wake up wondering if they would be turned out into the street. She imagined a space of her own, no matter how modest, no matter how broken, where she could close a door and know that the night belonged only to them. It was not luxury she wanted, but safety. Not comfort, but the dignity of a home, however fragile. The following morning she rose before dawn, her body aching from the thin mattress and the weight of exhaustion. She placed her son carefully into a sling against her chest, his small hand curling around the fabric as though anchoring himself to her. The city streets were quiet as she walked, her shoes worn thin, her eyes searching for something that might resemble a sign. At the corner of a newsstand, beneath faded papers and cheap flyers, her gaze snagged on a notice printed in black ink. Old vehicles for sale, cheap, some beyond repair, cash only. Her pulse quickened, though she did not yet understand why. She tore the strip of paper with the phone number and tucked it into her pocket. The day stretched long as she weighed the madness of it. Who in their right mind would think of buying a vehicle when they barely had enough to eat? But Maria's desperation was not bound by reason. She could see in her imagination the frame of an old bus or van stripped bare, not as junk, but as shelter. The thought carried both terror and possibility. She fed her son with formula she could scarcely afford, and while he suckled quietly, she whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "I'll find us something, little one. Something more than this." As evening settled, she returned to the motel, her heart heavier than the baby she carried. The blinking neon mocked her with its relentless rhythm, a reminder that time was running out. She sat on the bed and unfolded the slip of paper again, her hands trembling. The number was still there, stark and real. With a deep breath, she reached for the motel phone, the receiver cool against her cheek. Her voice shook as she asked about the vehicles, about the prices, about whether anything might be left for someone with next to nothing. The man on the other end sounded rough, but not unkind. He told her where to go, an old yard on the edge of town, filled with machines too tired to work anymore. she could come and see. That night she hardly slept. The baby stirred and whimpered, and she held him close, rocking gently until he quieted. But her mind remained restless, racing with thoughts of rust and dust, and the faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, within the bones of a forgotten machine, she could carve out a new life. She imagined the stares of strangers, the disbelief if they knew she was considering turning a broken bus into a home. Yet the thought did not shame her. It gave her strength. For the first time since the divorce, she felt as though there might be a path, however narrow, that led forward. When dawn broke again, she packed what little she owned into a worn backpack, a few clothes, a half-empty can of baby formula, diapers folded neatly, though they were nearly gone. She wrapped her son in a blanket, kissed his forehead, and whispered that they were going on an adventure. The word felt strange in her mouth, too light for the weight of their reality, but it made her smile. Perhaps he was too small to understand, but she believed children absorbed more than words. If she believed in the adventure, maybe he would too. The walk to the bus stop seemed longer than it should have, the straps of the sling cutting into her shoulders, the pack heavy against her back. The city thinned into suburbs and soon into stretches of warehouses and empty lots. The further she went, the less familiar the streets became, until finally she stood before the chain-link gate of the yard she had been told about. A crooked sign announced the business name, its paint peeling, the letters barely legible. Behind the fence, hulking shapes loomed in silence, their windows dark, their metal skins scarred with time. Maria hesitated, clutching the baby tighter, feeling the enormity of what she was about to step into. This was not just a purchase, not just a gamble with the last of her money. This was the line between despair and determination, between surrender and survival. She drew a breath, squared her shoulders, and pushed the gate open. The creak of the hinges echoed in the empty lot, a sound both foreboding and liberating. Her journey had brought her to the edge of ruin, but as she crossed into that graveyard of machines, she carried with her the seed of something greater. It was not yet a plan, not yet a certainty, but it was a beginning. And for Maria, with her child against her heart and the future stretched thin before her, a beginning was enough. The morning air was sharp with the tang of rust and oil as Maria stepped through the crooked gate into the yard. The place spread out before her like a graveyard for machines, row after row of forgotten vehicles that had once carried lives and stories, but now stood in silence, their windows broken and their paint faded. The ground was uneven beneath her worn shoes, gravel crunching underfoot, and weeds pushed up between the cracks like stubborn reminders that life could grow even in places where hope had long since died. She adjusted the sling that held her son close to her chest, pressing her lips to his fine hair for comfort, and forced herself to keep moving forward. The yard smelled of dust and gasoline, of iron left too long in the sun, and as she walked deeper into the maze of metal skeletons, she felt as though she had entered another world, one both desolate and strangely sacred. Each bus and van and truck bore its scars proudly, patches of orange rust and peeling paint, headlights clouded with age. Some leaned to one side as though bowing under the weight of years, others stood stubbornly upright, their tires long flat but their frames refusing to yield. It was a place where time had slowed, where endings lingered longer than they should. And yet, as Maria looked around, she felt a pulse beneath the ruin, something unspoken whispering that perhaps not everything here was truly finished. Her son stirred against her chest, letting out a soft sound, and she whispered a reassurance she did not fully believe. "We're just looking, little one, just looking." The truth was that she had come here to gamble everything she had left, but admitting it aloud would have made the risk feel too heavy. She needed to pretend that she still had choices, that this was not the last stop on a journey of dwindling options. At the far end of the yard, a man emerged from a small shack, cobbled together from corrugated metal and plywood. His overalls were stained black with grease, his face weathered, the lines etched deep by sun and labor. He wiped his hands on a rag as he approached, his eyes narrowing not with suspicion, but with curiosity. He glanced at the baby first, then at Maria, and she braced herself for pity. She had grown used to those looks, The ones that said people saw her as broken, fragile, someone to be pitied but not respected. Yet the man's gaze held something steadier, a quiet assessment rather than judgment. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice low and rough, carrying the gravel of age. Maria nodded, her throat dry. "I heard you had vehicles for sale. Something cheap." The word cheap felt humiliating, but it was the truth, and she had no time left for pride. The man gestured toward the rows of buses. "Plenty to choose from. Most folks pick them for parts. Not much else they're good for anymore." Her eyes scanned the line of hulking shapes, and though many were nearly identical in their decay, one caught her attention immediately. It stood half hidden behind a collapsed fence in a tangle of weeds, its yellow paint faded almost to white, the word "school" barely legible above the cracked windshield. The body of the bus was covered in patches of rust, like an old soldier's battle scars, but its frame remained solid. The windows were clouded, some missing entirely, and vines crept through the broken glass, wrapping around the metal like nature's chains. Yet as Maria stared at it, she felt something stir inside her, a faint echo of possibility. She walked toward it slowly, her heart pounding. To anyone else it was nothing more than a ruin, destined to collapse into the earth with time, but she saw it differently. She imagined stripping out the broken seats, cleaning the grime from the walls, patching the roof to keep out the rain. She imagined a crib tucked against one wall, a small stove near the front, blankets hanging as makeshift curtains. It was absurd, perhaps even foolish, but the vision rooted itself firmly in her mind. For the first time in weeks, her imagination offered her not dread, but hope. The man followed her gaze and let out a small huff of amusement. "That one's been sitting there longer than I can remember. No one touches it. Too much work." Maria swallowed hard. "How much?" He tilted his head, studying her. She knew what he saw, the tired lines under her eyes, the thinness of her frame, the way she clutched the baby as though he were the last anchor, keeping her from sinking. He saw someone who had already been stripped of so much she had nothing left to bargain with. Yet something softened in his expression, a flicker of compassion buried beneath his gruffness. "For you?" he said slowly. $1. Her breath caught. She thought she had misheard, that perhaps exhaustion was playing tricks on her ears. $1? He nodded. $1. But there's a catch. You take that old bus, you do something with it. Make it worth more than rust. Don't let it sit and rot the way it has for years. That's the only condition." Maria stood frozen, her mind reeling. $1 was all she could spare, all that remained after food and diapers and the barest essentials. But the weight of the decision pressed on her shoulders. $1 meant commitment, meant accepting not just a broken bus, but the responsibility to transform it. She felt the baby shift in her arms, his tiny fingers brushing her collarbone, and the choice crystallized in that touch. He deserved more than drifting from place to place, more than nights spent in motels that smelled of mildew and fear. He deserved a home, however small, however humble. Her hand trembled as she reached into her pocket and pulled out the last bill she could part with. She pressed it into the man's hand, and in that moment it felt less like a transaction and more like a vow. She was buying not a bus, but a chance. The man nodded once, his expression unreadable, and turned back toward his shack, leaving her to stand before the bus with her son. The vines rustled in the breeze, the broken windows reflecting fragments of the sun, and for a moment it seemed to her as though the bus itself was watching, waiting to see if she truly had the courage to claim it. She stepped closer, laying her free hand against the cool metal of the door. The paint flaked beneath her touch, but the surface was solid, steady. It was not much, not by any reasonable measure, but it was more than she had yesterday. Her son stirred again, letting out a soft sigh, and Maria whispered, "This is it, little one. Our last chance." As she stood there, the emptiness of the past weeks seemed to shift, just slightly, into something else. She had walked into the yard carrying despair, but she was leaving with a fragile ember of hope. It was small, easily extinguished, but it was there. And as she turned toward the motel for the last time, she carried not just her child, but the first fragile thread of a future she would fight to build, inside the broken frame of a forgotten bus. The motel room was no longer hers, not even for another night. When Maria returned that evening with the folded receipt in her pocket and the keys to a forgotten bus clutched tightly in her palm, she understood that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The manager had already replaced the sheets, and another family had taken the space that only a few hours ago had held her tears and her fears. She did not linger. Instead, she walked back across the city with her son sleeping heavily against her chest, the weight of him both a burden and a blessing. The bus was waiting, and though she knew it offered nothing like comfort, it was theirs now. That word alone, ours, lit a fragile spark inside her. The lot was quiet when she returned. The man who had sold it to her was nowhere to be seen, and the rows of skeletal vehicles stood in silence, watching with hollow windows as she made her way to the one she had chosen. The sun was setting, and its fading light glowed against the vines that twisted through the broken glass. For a moment she hesitated, her heart thudding against her ribs. She wondered if she had been a fool, if trading the last of her money for this relic had doomed them both. But then her son whimpered softly in his sleep, and she pressed a kiss to his temple, grounding herself in his presence. He was too young to understand, but one day he would know she had tried. The door protested as she pulled it open, the hinges shrieking in pain. A musty wave of air spilled out, thick with mildew, dust, and the sharp bite of rust. She stepped inside cautiously, her feet crunching against glass and debris. It was darker than she expected, though shafts of light slanted through the cracked windows, illuminating the decay like ghostly fingers. The seats were torn, their stuffing spilling out like the innards of an animal left too long in the sun. Graffiti scarred the walls, faded words from children or wanderers who had passed through long after the bus had ceased to carry its intended passengers. Maria lowered herself onto the nearest intact seat, clutching her son and rocking him gently as her eyes adjusted. The silence was overwhelming. It did not feel like a room, not yet, but like a tomb. Every surface spoke of abandonment, of years of neglect. For a moment, despair pressed in on her. What had she done? This was no place for a child. This was madness. The temptation to weep rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down. Crying would change nothing. She had chosen this path, and now she had to walk it. She set her son in his sling across her lap, his tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, and forced herself to move. From the worn backpack at her side, she pulled a half-empty bottle of water and an old rag. It was pitifully inadequate, but it was something. She found a broken broom handle in the corner, its bristles bent and gray, and set about sweeping the floor in small, determined strokes. The dust rose, filling the air and making her cough, but she pressed on. Each pile of debris pushed out the door was more than dirt. It was a piece of despair she was casting aside. Hours passed in this way, her body aching from labor and her stomach rumbling with hunger. She ripped out the worst of the seats, dragging their carcasses down the steps and leaving them in a heap outside. The sound of tearing fabric and groaning metal filled the evening air. And though it was exhausting, it was also strangely liberating. Each ruined seat that left the bus seemed to take with it some of the weight that had crushed her heart. She imagined space opening, possibility blooming. It was still ruin, but it was ruin that could be reshaped. By the time darkness fell, she had cleared a small corner near the back. The floor was uneven and cracked, but it was bare. From her bag, she pulled a thin blanket and spread it over the ground, then laid another atop it. It was not much, but when she lowered her son into the makeshift nest, he sighed contentedly and curled against the fabric, his fist tightening around the edge as though it were a treasure. Maria sat beside him, her back against the cold wall, and let her eyes close. Exhaustion claimed her, but beneath it was a flicker of peace. They were not in a motel rented by the night. They were not on the street. They were in a space that belonged to them, however broken it might be. The following morning she woke stiff and chilled, the sound of her son's cries echoing in the hollow bus. She gathered him in her arms, soothing him, and as she did, her eyes fell on the patch of light spilling across the floorboards. Dust motes danced in the beam, glittering as though the sun itself was offering a blessing. She breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the stale air, and for the first time it did not choke her. It filled her with resolve. She began again, this time pulling down the rotted curtains that hung limply from rusted rods. She bundled them up and tossed them outside, then set about scrubbing at the windows with what little water she had left. The glass did not become clear, but the streaks of grime lightened enough to let in more sun. Each task, however small, felt monumental. It was proof that she could act, that she could change her surroundings even when her circumstances seemed immovable. At midday, she left the bus briefly, walking to the nearest store with the last coins she dared spend. She returned with nails, a roll of plastic sheeting, and a box of crackers for herself. For her son, she carried formula in her bag, purchased yesterday with what little she had left. She patched the largest holes in the windows with the plastic, tacking it into place with nails and scraps of wood scavenged from the lot. It was crude, but it kept the wind from howling through. As night came again, she laid her son down in the corner once more, this time with an extra layer beneath him to soften the hard floor. She sat beside him and listened to the silence. It was no longer oppressive. It was possibility. She whispered stories to him, stories about how the bus would one day be a real home. She told him there would be curtains to keep out the cold, a bed where he could sleep soundly, a small stove where she could warm his milk. He was too young to understand, but she told him anyway, because speaking the words aloud made them feel true. On the third day, she rose with sore muscles, but a determination that surprised even her. She pulled up the cracked linoleum that clung stubbornly to the floor, revealing the warped wood beneath. She carried bag after bag of scraps outside, her arms trembling with the effort. Each time she looked back at the space she had cleared, she felt a surge of pride. It was slow, agonizingly slow, but it was progress. Her son watched from his blanket, wide-eyed and quiet, as though he too sensed the change. When she paused to rest, she carried him through the bus, pointing at the empty spaces and describing what they would become. Here, she told him, would be his little bed. Here, a shelf for his toys. Here, a table where they could sit together. The words painted pictures on the ruined walls, and in her mind, she could already see it. By the end of the week, the bus no longer looked like a tomb. It was still broken, still filled with shadows, but it was theirs. The air smelled less of mildew and more of sweat and determination. The piles of debris outside testified to her labor, and inside, a small corner had begun to resemble something close to shelter. It was not comfort, but it was safety. Not beauty, but dignity. Maria sat with her son in her lap, rocking him gently as the evening sun poured through the patched windows. Her body ached, her hands were blistered, but her heart was lighter than it had been in months. She kissed the top of his head and whispered, "We'll make this work. This is not the end. This is our beginning." And as the bus stood quietly around them, no longer only a relic of the past, but the fragile skeleton of a future, Maria believed her own words. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, she dared to imagine that home was not something she had lost forever. It was something she was building, piece by piece, with her own hands, in the hollow belly of a broken bus. The days bled into each other inside the rusted skeleton of the bus, each sunrise beginning with the sharp cry of her baby, and each night closing with Maria collapsing in exhaustion onto the thin blanket she had spread across the warped floor. At first, the routine of cleaning and clearing filled her with a kind of stubborn energy, a sense that every bag of garbage dragged outside and every seat torn from its bolts was one more step toward reclaiming control of her life. But as the weeks wore on, the glow of novelty dimmed, and the harsh truth of survival set in. Hope was a fragile thing, and it flickered each time the temperature dropped at night, each time she woke to find her son's tiny hands chilled even beneath the layers of blankets she had wrapped him in. Autumn was slipping toward winter, and the cold pressed harder through the patched windows and the thin plastic she had nailed into place. At night, the wind howled through the cracks she hadn't yet managed to seal, and she would curl her body around her son to keep him warm, her arms numb from holding the position for hours. When rain came, it was worse. The roof leaked in 3 different places, water dripping rhythmically into bowls she had scavenged, the sound a constant reminder of her inadequacy. She worked during the day to seal the leaks with tape and scraps, But the rain always found new ways in, and every storm filled her with dread. Food was another constant battle. With the last of her savings gone to formula and diapers, Maria sought out any work she could find. She walked the neighborhood near the yard, knocking on doors and offering her hands for cleaning, for laundry, for errands. Some turned her away without a word, others pressed a few dollars into her hand out of pity, and a few offered small jobs that left her bent and aching, but grateful. She cleaned apartments that smelled of mildew worse than her bus, scrubbed kitchens sticky with grease, and hauled laundry up and down narrow staircases. Every coin she earned she counted with trembling fingers, her mind already dividing it between her baby's needs and the barest scraps for herself. She ate little, often skipping meals entirely to make sure there was enough formula. Crackers, sometimes a bruised apple, and on rare days a sandwich someone gave her as thanks for her labor. The hunger gnawed at her, but she told herself it did not matter. What mattered was the child in her arms, the child whose eyes searched hers for reassurance, who deserved more than a life of scarcity. Yet even with this resolve, there were moments in the quiet of the night when despair closed around her like a fist. She would sit on the floor, her back pressed against the cold metal wall, her son asleep beside her, and stare into the shadows. A voice inside whispered cruelly that she had made a mistake, that the bus would never be more than a rotting shell, that she had doomed them both with her foolish hope. Still, she refused to surrender. Even as doubt gnawed at her, she forced herself each day to take another step. She patched cracks with scraps of wood she found near the lot. She lined the floor with flattened cardboard boxes to cover the worst of the warping. She strung up blankets along the windows to block the drafts. They were pitiful gestures, but each one gave her a brief sense of progress, a fragile illusion of control. When she felt the weight of futility pressing hardest, she looked at her son and found the strength to go on. His small smile, the way his tiny fingers wrapped around hers, was enough to push back the darkness. The people in the neighborhood began to notice her persistence. A mechanic who worked in a garage down the road once passed by the lot and found her hammering scraps into place. He shook his head at the sight of a young woman with blistered hands working in the fading light, but something in her determination struck him. He gave her a handful of nails and an old screwdriver, tools worn from years of use but precious in her eyes. Another woman, older and soft-spoken, saw her walking with the baby strapped to her chest and quietly offered her a bag of second-hand clothes for him, along with a few blankets. Maria accepted with tears she tried to hide. Small mercies like these did not solve her problems, but they reminded her she was not entirely invisible. The hardest nights were those when the cold sank into her bones and would not let go. She lay awake listening to her baby's breathing, her mind racing with fears. What if he got sick? What if the roof collapsed in a storm? What if she failed him completely? These questions haunted her, heavier than hunger or exhaustion. But with every dawn came a new chance to try again. She rose with aching limbs, held her son close to her chest, and whispered promises into the morning air. Promises that she would not give up, that she would make this bus into a home, no matter how impossible it seemed. There were small victories that gave her fuel. The first time she managed to stop one of the leaks, she felt like she had conquered a mountain. When she created a little crib from a box lined with soft blankets, her son slept peacefully, and she allowed herself to believe for a moment that he was safe. When she managed to cook a simple meal on a borrowed camping stove, the smell filled the bus and transformed it, however briefly, into something that felt like a home. But the trials continued to come. One night, a storm rolled in with furious winds that tore at the plastic covering the windows. The rain came sideways, driving through the cracks, soaking the blankets and sending chills through her son's tiny body. Maria sat upright through the night, holding him close beneath her jacket, rocking him until the storm passed. In the morning, she surveyed the damage with weary eyes. Puddles on the floor, sodden blankets, and a bus that seemed to mock her with its stubborn fragility. Yet even then, she set about drying what she could in the thin sunlight, refusing to give in to despair. It was during one of these long days of labor that Maria realized something profound. The work itself was changing her. Each nail driven, each scrap patched, each broken piece cleared away was not only rebuilding the bus but rebuilding her. She was no longer the woman who had walked into the lot with nothing but fear and $1 in her hand. She was becoming someone stronger, someone who could endure the storms and still rise to face another day. One evening, as she sat with her son cradled against her, watching the sun dip low and turn the rusted metal of the bus into molten gold, she felt a shift inside her. The bus was not yet a home, but it was no longer a ruin either. It was a vessel carrying her through her trials, teaching her to fight for something more than survival. She pressed a kiss to her son's forehead and whispered, "We're going to make it, little one. No matter how heavy the trials, we'll find our way." The night fell around them and the cold crept in again, but she no longer felt crushed by it. Instead, she felt something like defiance. The trials had not broken her. They had shaped her. And though the road ahead was long and filled with shadows, she was ready to walk it, step by painful step, until the bus became not a tomb of rust, but a sanctuary of resilience and love. The storms had passed, leaving behind skies the color of steel and air that bit at the skin. And though Maria's body ached from the endless rhythm of patching and cleaning, she could not stop. The bus was slowly shedding its skin of ruin, one stubborn piece at a time, and she clung to each small change as proof that their lives were not fixed in despair. Yet the labor had worn her down to her core, and on one gray morning, with her son bundled in layers of second-hand clothes, she felt herself staring at the warped floorboards with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Something about the uneven surface nagged at her. She had noticed it before, the way one board near the gutted kitchenette seemed looser than the others, but until now she had ignored it. Today, for reasons she could not explain, she knelt and pressed her palm against it. The wood groaned softly beneath her hand. She pushed harder and felt it shift slightly, as if it concealed something it had no wish to reveal. Her son let out a babble of sound from his nest of blankets, and the noise seemed to encourage her. She fetched the screwdriver the mechanic had given her and wedged it into the seam. The board resisted, but she was relentless, prying, levering, until with a squeal of protest the plank lifted free. Dust rose in a fine cloud, and beneath the board, nestled in a shallow cavity, lay a box dulled by years of neglect. Maria's breath caught, her heart hammered as she reached down and pulled it free, the weight heavier than she expected. It was a simple tin container, its edges eaten with rust, the metal cool against her fingers. For a long moment she simply sat with it in her lap, too afraid to open it. The mind can spin countless dreams in the span of a heartbeat, and hers danced with wild possibilities. Money, valuables, something that might change everything. But she forced herself to breathe slowly, to tamp down the rush of hope that threatened to unmake her. Whatever lay inside had waited years, perhaps decades, and it would not vanish if she took her time. When she finally pried the lid open, the hinges crackling with disuse, what she found was not money or jewels but a bundle of papers, yellowed with age, tied neatly with a faded ribbon. She lifted them carefully, brushing away dust, and found herself holding a diary, its pages dense with looping handwriting. On the inside cover, a name was scrawled: Walter H. Granger, driver, 1974. She stared at the words, her lips moving silently as she repeated them. The bus had belonged to someone once, not just as a machine, but as a vessel of a man's daily life. She began to read. The entries were simple, but they pulsed with warmth. Walter had written about the children he drove every day, about their laughter and their fights, about the way they carved their initials into the seats when they thought he wasn't looking. He wrote of the seasons passing through the windows, of autumn leaves scattering across the aisles, of winter mornings when the children clambered aboard with cheeks red from the cold. There were stories of small kindnesses, a boy who shared his sandwich with another who had none, a girl who left him an apple with a note that said, "Thank you for driving us safe." Maria read in silence, her son gurgling beside her as though he too felt the heartbeat of the words. Each entry painted the bus not as a husk of metal, but as a living thing that had carried the weight of countless stories. She could almost hear the echoes of children's laughter bouncing against the walls, almost see the faces pressed against the glass as the world streamed by. For years, this place had been more than a vehicle. It had been a moving cocoon of life and memory. As the pages turned, she felt the years unravel. Walter wrote of his pride in keeping the bus running, even when the district had long since stopped caring about its upkeep. He called it his old girl, spoke of her like a companion. He wrote of how he believed she carried not just children, but their dreams, their futures, their innocence. And then, near the end, his tone changed. The lines became shorter, his handwriting more unsteady. He wrote of retiring, of how the bus would soon be parked for good. And his final entry stopped her cold. This bus has carried the laughter of hundreds. It has been more than wheels and steel. It has been a keeper of hope. If someone finds her one day, I pray they let her live again. Let her give shelter. Let her hold another story. Maria pressed her hand to her mouth, overcome. The words struck her like a bell, reverberating through every hollow corner of her spirit. It felt as though Walter had written them directly to her, across decades, as though he had known she would come, broken and desperate, searching for more than shelter. Tears blurred her vision, and she whispered aloud to the silence, "I'll do it. I'll make her live again." Her son stirred at the sound of her voice, his tiny fingers stretching toward the diary as though claiming it too. She laughed softly through her tears and kissed his hand. The despair that had shadowed her in recent weeks seemed to lift, replaced by something steadier. It was no longer just her fight against ruin. She was not merely patching metal and wood. She was answering a call, fulfilling a wish left in ink decades ago. That night, she read by the light of a small lamp until the words swam before her eyes. She imagined Walter's hands guiding the wheel, his eyes watching the road ahead, his heart bound to the children behind him. She thought of the years when this bus had been filled with voices instead of silence, and she vowed to restore some measure of that life. She did not have much, but she had her determination, and now she had a reason greater than herself. In the days that followed, the diary became her compass. Each time exhaustion threatened to drag her under, she opened its pages and read Walter's words again, letting them remind her that this bus had been alive once and could be again. She found herself speaking to her son not in terms of if, but when. When the bus became warm, when the roof no longer leaked, when there was a place for him to crawl and play. She spoke these promises aloud, weaving them into the fabric of the days, until they became as real as the bus's rusted walls. As autumn deepened, she noticed the way the light shifted inside the bus at sunset, painting the interior with a golden glow. She imagined that it was Walter's blessing, a silent nod of approval. The more she worked, the more she felt his presence, not haunting, but encouraging. The bus had been more than a machine for him, and now it was becoming more than a shelter for her. It was a link in a chain of lives, carrying forward a legacy of hope. Maria no longer saw the cracks and stains as signs of defeat. She saw them as scars, reminders of what the bus had endured. Like herself, it had been battered, neglected, nearly abandoned. But like her, it still stood, waiting for the chance to become something more. On one especially cold evening, as she tucked her son beneath the blankets and laid the diary gently beside her, Maria whispered into the quiet, "We'll give you a new story, old girl. You and me and him. We'll keep the hope alive." The bus groaned softly in the night wind, and she let herself believe it was an answer. For the first time since she had stepped into the lot, she did not feel like she was surviving inside a tomb. She felt as though she was standing on sacred ground, a place where past and present intertwined, and where the future was waiting to be written. The secret of the bus was no longer hidden. It was alive in her hands, in her son's laughter, in every stroke of work she put into rebuilding. And as she drifted into sleep, her head resting against the cool wall, she knew beyond doubt that she was no longer just a mother fighting against despair. She was a keeper of hope, chosen by chance but bound by promise, and she would not fail. The diary had become more than paper and ink. It was a covenant, a fragile link between the man who had once steered the bus through countless mornings and the woman who now knelt in its hollowed shell with blistered hands and a hungry child. Every page Maria read filled her with the sense that she was not alone, that this battle to carve a home out of ruin was part of something larger. Walter had believed the bus held hope, and now it was her turn to prove him right. She no longer saw her labor as desperation. It became devotion. And with devotion came the stirrings of transformation. The work began in earnest when she noticed how others in the neighborhood had started to pay attention. The mechanic who had once pressed old tools into her hands returned one afternoon with a half-empty bucket of sealant and a length of roofing material. He didn't speak much, simply nodded at her progress and dropped the supplies on the ground beside her. His silence was not cold but respectful, as though words might cheapen what he saw her attempting. Maria thanked him, her voice trembling, and that night she patched the largest of the leaks with more confidence than she had felt in weeks. Days later, the older woman who had given her blankets appeared again, this time carrying a bundle of mismatched fabric and a small wooden stool. "My husband built it years ago," she said, her voice quiet, almost apologetic, as though offering too little. Maria accepted it with both hands, her gratitude spilling into tears she could not contain. She set the stool near the window and draped the fabrics across the bus's raw interior. And though they were faded and threadbare, they softened the hard lines, muting the scars of rust with whispers of color. Slowly, what had been a carcass of metal began to show the first signs of life. The cracked floorboards were covered with planks scavenged from pallets Maria dragged from alleys. She hammered them into place one by one, her hands raw but steady. The uneven wood became a patchwork floor, imperfect but solid. Where vines had clawed through broken windows, she nailed panels of plywood, sealing the gaping holes. Plastic sheeting still covered some gaps, but even those seemed sturdier now, weighted by the sense of progress. The air grew cleaner as she scrubbed away years of grime with buckets of soapy water, rinsing until her knuckles bled. Her son watched all of it with wide, solemn eyes, as if he too understood that this was not merely cleaning, but rebirth. When she laid him on a pallet wrapped in blankets and worked by the light of a flickering lamp, he gurgled contentedly, his tiny fists punching the air in approval. The bus was no longer just shelter from rain and wind. It was becoming a home shaped by love as much as by labor. The mechanic returned again, this time with a rusted but functioning camping stove. He showed her how to connect it to a small fuel canister, and when the flame hissed to life, Maria stared at it as though it were a miracle. For the first time, she could warm water without begging favors. She boiled a pot, poured it into a basin, and bathed her son properly, his delighted squeals echoing off the bus walls. That night she made herself tea, the taste plain and bitter, but it filled her chest with warmth and the certainty that she was moving forward. One by one, the people who had at first regarded her with suspicion began to offer small acts of kindness. A teenager passing by tossed her a bundle of scrap wood, saying he'd seen her working and figured she could use it. A shop owner left a bag of bruised fruit at the lot's gate. Even strangers she didn't know by name sometimes paused to nod at her efforts. Maria felt herself becoming part of something she hadn't expected. A quiet web of community spun around her persistence. She had thought she was entirely alone, but the bus was teaching her otherwise. Inside, the transformation deepened. Maria cleared a corner and built a makeshift kitchenette with salvaged shelves. She scrubbed and polished a piece of metal until it gleamed, turning it into a countertop. Above it, she tacked fabric as a curtain to hide the rough wall. The area where seats had once lined the aisle became a cozy nook with blankets layered thick, and she arranged the wooden stool beside it so she could sit while feeding her son. At the back, she carved out a sleeping space, laying down cushions and folding blankets until the hard edges softened into a kind of nest. It was small, cramped, imperfect, but it was theirs. Each evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the rusted exterior in copper light, Maria lit her lamp and sat quietly, holding her son while the bus seemed to breathe around them. The air inside had changed. Where it had once smelled of mold and abandonment, it now carried hints of soap, wood, and the faint sweetness of fabric warmed by sunlight. It was not just a shelter. It was alive again. The diary remained near her always. Some nights she read aloud from its pages, her voice weaving Walter's words into the present. She wanted her son to hear them, to feel that they were not starting from nothing but continuing a story written long before he was born. "Let her hold another story," Walter had written, and Maria would close her eyes and whisper, "She is. She's holding ours." Winter crept closer, But the bus no longer felt like a coffin. The gaps were sealed, the roof patched, the drafts blocked by curtains and fabric. The small stove gave off enough warmth to cut the worst of the chill, and Maria learned to ration the fuel carefully, saving it for nights when the frost threatened to creep inside. Her son slept more peacefully, curled in his crib of blankets, and she sometimes allowed herself to rest beside him without fear that the cold would wake him. One evening, after a day of relentless work sanding the salvaged planks she had fitted into the floor, Maria stood back and truly looked at the space she had shaped. The golden light of sunset streamed through the clean windows, catching on the wooden stool, the tidy nook of blankets, the shelves holding their meager supplies. For the first time, she saw not ruin, but beauty. It was a humble beauty, born of struggle, but it shone with the unmistakable glow of resilience. She held her son up to the window, showing him the light spilling in. "Look," she whispered, "this is our home now." His small hand pressed against the glass, leaving a tiny print that seemed to seal the promise. That night, as Maria sat by the stove, the flames flickering, she felt a stillness settle deep within her. The heavy trials had not broken her. They had tempered her. The bus was not only resurrected in wood and fabric and flame, but in spirit. It had become a testament to her fight, a vessel reborn not just from ruin, but from love. She touched the diary resting on the counter, the worn pages filled with Walter's words, and thought of the line that had guided her. "Let her give shelter." She closed her eyes and smiled. The bust was no longer an abandoned carcass. It was a sanctuary, and she, once stripped of everything, had learned to build again. Not just walls, not just a roof, but a life. Maria knew there was still more to do, more storms to face, but she also knew the hardest part was behind her. The bus had found new breath, and so had she. It was not the end of their journey, only the beginning. The winter arrived quietly, carried on a wind that cut through the city like a knife and blanketed the nights in frost. Yet inside the bus, Maria found warmth that was more than physical. The patched walls held out the worst of the chill, the stove glowed with life whenever she lit it, and the layers of blankets and fabric softened the edges of the cold. More importantly, there was a sense of safety now, a steady rhythm of living that felt almost like peace. The diary sat close by on the shelf she had built. Her son slept soundly in the crib she had fashioned out of scavenged wood and cloth, and Maria herself no longer woke each morning with despair pressing on her chest. The bus had become a sanctuary, not perfect, not grand, but alive. Each morning she would rise before dawn, careful not to wake the baby, and sit by the window to watch the sky lighten. The frost traced delicate patterns across the glass, but the sight no longer filled her with dread. Instead, she saw it as a canvas, a fleeting artwork gifted by the season. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and whispered her gratitude for another day. Gratitude that they were not out in the open, not wandering, not drifting from shelter to shelter. Gratitude that her son's cheeks were warm against her breast as he stirred and reached for her hand. Gratitude that she had found strength within herself she had never known existed. The bus had changed in ways even she struggled to believe. Where once the roof leaked, now it stood solid, patched and sealed. Where once the floor groaned with rot, now it held the weight of their small life firmly. The corners that had been dark and suffocating now glowed with the light of her lamp, casting shadows that danced playfully instead of lurking menacingly. It was not the structure alone that had changed, but the spirit. The bus had become a living place, one that carried echoes of its past and breathed new purpose through her work. As the snow began to fall in delicate flurries, Maria found herself thinking not only of survival, but of the future. The diary's final words still resonated with her, reminding her that this bus was meant to hold another story. She believed now that it was theirs, hers and her son's, but she also sensed that their story did not end with staying still. The wheels, though stiff and rusted, were meant to turn again. She began to imagine journeys, not just of necessity, but of choice. She pictured the bus carrying them down long roads, past forests and fields, toward places where her son could laugh under new skies. She often found herself tracing the worn map she had once salvaged from a discarded pile of books. It was tattered and faded, but its lines stretched wide, promising horizons beyond the city's edge. In the evenings, when her son drifted into sleep, she would spread the map across the table, the lamp's glow pooling over its surface, and dream of paths they might one day take. It was not fantasy, it was possibility, and possibility was enough to keep her heart steady. Her neighbors continued to notice her resilience, and though they gave little in words, they gave in gestures. The mechanic returned one icy morning to help her coax the engine into a cough of life, and though it sputtered and groaned, it roared at last, sending vibrations through the floor that made Maria laugh aloud with disbelief. It was as though the bus itself had awakened from a long sleep, stretching its tired limbs in readiness. The older woman who had given her blankets pressed into her hands a small pot of flowers, fragile but bright even in the cold, and Maria placed them on the counter, a symbol of life blooming where once there had only been decay. Each act of kindness became part of the bus's story, woven into its resurrection. Maria no longer felt like a woman cut adrift by loss. She felt like a mother charting a course for her child, a keeper of hope who had taken the ashes of her past and turned them into something tangible. She had thought once that survival was all she could hope for. Now she dared to think of more. On one quiet night, as the snow fell thick and muffled the world outside, Maria held her son in her arms and sat by the window. His breath was warm against her neck, his tiny body relaxed in complete trust. She looked at the frost etched across the glass, at the lantern's glow reflecting in his eyes, and she understood something she had struggled to see before. They had already won. It was not wealth or stability or the trappings of a comfortable life, but something deeper. They had a home, a place that was theirs, and a future bound not by fear, but by possibility. She whispered to him as he dozed, telling him of the journeys they would take when the weather softened, of the fields they would see, of the rivers and the towns and the countless roads waiting to be explored. She told him that the world was wide but not unkind, that even in its harshness there were people willing to reach out, just as they had found here. She told him that no matter where they went, the bus would carry not just their bodies, but their story, a story born of struggle but shaped by love. When the baby's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, Maria laid him in his crib and stood for a long moment in the middle of the bus. She turned slowly, taking in the patched roof, the fabric curtains, the wooden stool, the little shelf lined with jars, the flowers on the counter. It was all so small, yet to her it felt vast. Vast because it represented the distance she had traveled within herself. She had stepped into this place broken, stripped of everything, and now she stood here whole. The bus creaked softly as the wind brushed against its frame, and Maria imagined Walter, the driver from long ago, smiling somewhere unseen. His words had found her, and she had answered them. The bus was no longer abandoned. It was resurrected, alive, carrying another story as he had hoped. She touched the diary resting on the shelf, her fingers lingering on its worn cover, and whispered her promise once more. "We'll keep it alive." As dawn approached, she spread the map across the table again, her fingers tracing the winding lines of highways and roads. She smiled, picturing the bus rolling forward under a sky washed clean by morning light, her son laughing beside her. The thought filled her with a sense of purpose stronger than fear, stronger than hunger or cold. It was the knowledge that the path ahead, though uncertain, was theirs to walk. The winter would pass, and with it new chances would come. She no longer felt bound to the ruins of her past. The bus was proof that from what is discarded, from what seems beyond saving, something new can rise. Maria lifted her son from his crib, held him against her heart, and turned her face toward the pale light seeping through the window. It was not the end of their journey. It was the beginning of a new path, carved from resilience, shaped by love, and carried forward by wheels that, though old and scarred, were ready to turn again. And in that quiet, as the bus stood strong against the winter wind, and the child stirred with a soft sigh, Maria understood that she had not simply survived. She had been reborn alongside this place of rust and steel. Together they would move forward, not away from what had been lost, but toward everything that still waited to be found. If Maria's story touched your heart, don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next journey. Share this video with someone who needs a spark of hope today, and click right here to watch the next incredible story waiting for you.